These are the Proverbs of Solomon, David's son, King of Israel. Their purpose is to teach people wisdom and discipline, to help them understand the insights of the wise. Their purpose is to teach people to live disciplined and successful lives, to help them do what is right, just, and fair. These proverbs will give insight to the simple, knowledge and discernment to the young. Let the wise listen to these proverbs and become even wiser. Let those with understanding receive guidance by exploring the meaning in these proverbs and parables, the words of the wise, and their riddles. Proverbs 1, verses 1 through 6. The book of Proverbs is a fascinating entry in the wisdom literature section of the Bible, and really a perfect pair with the Psalms that come before it. King Solomon, who we've talked about in many of the episodes talking about Kings and Chronicles, was offered by God to have anything he wanted. Solomon asked for wisdom, which pleased God, and he was granted supernatural wisdom. Proverbs is a part of that outpouring. Proverbs is unlike any other book in the Bible in that it is largely made up of a collection of phrases or wise sayings, right? It's not narratively based like most books, and it's not even a larger collection of poems or songs like the Psalms is. So, how should we read Proverbs? And how can we best learn from the wisdom in this book? To help us navigate the book of Proverbs is Dr. Christopher Ansberry, Associate Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Grove City College, and author of a brand new commentary on Proverbs. My name is Jason Whelan, and this is Navigating the Bible, Proverbs. All right, Dr. Chris Ansberry, thank you so much for joining as you help to navigate us through the book of Proverbs. Excited to keep going through the wisdom literature with you today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Justin.
So we're going to start with the basic details as we do with all of
it. Your name is Jason.
It is, but I've been called Justin many times, so it doesn't matter.
Can we edit? I don't want to start on that.
We can totally just take it again. That's no problem. All right, I'm going to clap us in. All right, Dr. Christopher Ansberry, thanks for joining us today, helping us navigate through the book of Proverbs. We continue through the wisdom literature, and I appreciate you being here to take us through Proverbs.
Jason, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's start with the basic details like we do for every one of these books. For Proverbs, do we know who wrote the book of Proverbs, and do we know when the book may have been written? And if we know these answers, historically going through these books, we haven't known many of the authorships, but if we know these, does it affect how we read the book of Proverbs?
Yeah. Do we know who wrote the book and when? Yes and no.
Yeah.
Proverbs is an anthology. It's a collection of collections. And the collections within the book are associated with different types of individuals. So Proverbs 1:1 opens with the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Proverbs 10:1 mentions Solomon yet again. These are the Proverbs of Solomon. Chapter 22, verse 17 attributes those materials to the words of the wise. Chapter 24, verse 23 attributes those materials also to the wise. In chapter 25, verse 1, we have, these are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah transcribed. And then in chapter 30, we have the words of Agur. And in chapter 31, the words of Lemuel, which his mother taught him. So a variety of collections, each of which are attributed to different individuals. And when taken together, it seems to suggest that we have a growing, fluid, developing book across the canonical period, associated with many different individuals. On one side, you have Solomon. So let's just think in the 900s BC, Hezekiah and his men, the 700s, and then Agur and Lemuel, who seem to be foreigners. They're non-Israelites. And the language of Proverbs 30, even 31, seems to suggest a much later sort of dating. So a growing, fluid book. And yet, Proverbs 1, verse 1 is the title to the entire book, and it's associated with Solomon. So I think that might help us read the book as a whole, where despite the fact that we have all these different collections associated with a variety of different individuals, it seems that all of the materials in the book align with Solomonic wisdom. I think that might help us as we approach a book where materials come from all different kinds of periods and all different kinds of people.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to remember as the reader, you have King Solomon who prayed for wisdom. Right? He asked God for the gift of wisdom, and so I think many people attribute the book of Proverbs like, oh, it's the work of Solomon. That's great, but then you actually dig into it, and you're like, okay, well, I actually see a lot of authorship being accredited in different places. But to put it into this general counsel of the wisdom of Solomon, that's kind of been collected into this tome of wise practices, of wise sayings. I think that's helpful to, that it's okay to think of it as a book of Solomon, because it all comes from this era of wisdom that is being first and foremost brought down by Solomon. Is that kind of a right way to think about it?
Yeah. And it's all in that stream of his wisdom that, of course, is framed sort of theologically in relation to the Lord and through the fear of the Lord. So I think other materials associated with the wise or with Agur or Lemuel, they're included because they align with that wisdom.
And it's probably fair to assume that most of the ones that were attributed to Solomon were probably written in his good days before he became, not the best king.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think, there's a lot of discussion out there as to whether or not, Solomon wrote all of these that are attributed to him, or he was responsible for collecting them.
Oh, okay.
So even think of like our Proverbs today, birds of a feather flock together. Like who's the author of that proverb?
Yeah.
And does it matter who the author is? Or by virtue of the fact that it teaches a traditional truth that we acknowledge, its authority is based on its truth rather than, whoever came up with it.
Sure.
Or too many cooks spoil the broth, or whatever it might be. Who are the authors of these proverbs? We don't know, but that doesn't mean that they're not authoritative and truthful.
Okay, so that's helpful. So this question, I usually like asking, I think for Proverbs, you're going to have a pretty easy time with this one. How would you describe the book of Proverbs in one sentence?
Yeah, I think in one sentence, I'd latch on to the opening verses of the book, which sort of orient you to the whole and say, the book of Proverbs is about the formation or the transformation of our character in accord with wisdom and virtue.
Helpful. So now we normally would go into a narrative flow, for all of the historical books, wherever, for most of the books in the wisdom literature, we have to approach this in a different way. So instead, I kind of want to focus on how we best read the book of Proverbs. So what advice would you give to people? So like if you were teaching a class on Proverbs, how would you advise your students to read the book?
Yeah, great question. I advise my students to read the book along 3 lines. Now, whether or not they get this or not, that's another question altogether. I give them really 3 pieces of advice for reading the book of Proverbs. The first piece of advice is to read the book of Proverbs with an eye to its pedagogy, how it teaches, how the different literary forms in the book are designed to form us in different ways. I teach students in college classrooms in a much different way than I teach my 6-year-old. So we employ different forms of teaching depending on who we're talking to, but also for distinctive purposes. And Proverbs does the same thing. Its different literary forms are all designed to form us, especially to cultivate wisdom and virtue, but to do that in different ways. And I think that's especially important in something like Proverbs chapters 1-9, where you have these extended instructions, but they're cast in different forms. They're designed to form us in different ways. And I think the best example of that is you have these 3 different instructions, all of which concern this strange or adulterous woman. And it's like, why are we talking about this on 3 different occasions? Well, not only because it's important, but I think we do well to account for the fact that it's being taught in very different ways. Yeah. So in chapter 5, where the strange or adulterous woman first comes into play, there, the intention of that discourse is to orient our desire to the appropriate object of desire, your spouse, not this strange or adulterous woman. And so Proverbs 5 includes all this language from the Song of Songs that's intended to direct our desire toward our spouse into the context of marriage rather than to the strange or adulterous woman. At the end of chapter 6, by contrast, it's the sort of I'm going to scare the life out of you approach. If you go after the strange or adulterous woman, all of these horrific things are going to happen to you, and her husband is not going to let you go. You are going to experience some serious pain. Proverbs 7 then reintroduces her and does something I think very counterintuitive to us, which is to kind of lure us to feel the temptation that this woman will bring. It's the first time she's permitted to speak in all of Proverbs 1-9. And it's as if we're to eavesdrop on the conversation to hear what it might feel like to be tempted by her seductive discourse, so as to prevent this sort of fate that befalls this youth in chapter 7. So an attentiveness in the first instance to what kind of teaching, how is this material being taught, is sort of a key. It's pedagogy to reading the book. That's the first piece of advice. The second would be to read the middle of the book, chapters 10-29, along its developing curriculum. So I tend to think with William Brown and some others that the middle of the book is really set up in a manner comparable to our educational curricula. So just like we need to learn addition and subtraction before we learn algebra, there's a developing curriculum. So also Proverbs 10-29 is kind of set up in that way, where chapters 10-15 are pretty elementary. I mean, there's nuance there, but all of the sayings tend to be antithetical. They're black and white. They're contrasts. They're kind of easing us in to thinking in binaries and these different kinds of categories. The world seems to be a pretty simple place. And then in Proverbs 16-22, we ease into intermediate wisdom. Now we don't have any more strict antitheses. The literary forms are different. New themes are introduced. Themes that we were encountered earlier are now nuanced and developed. Chapters 22-24, we have, educational, vocational wisdom, where we're being placed in all these different vocations of life so as to discern how we might live in a manner that is wise and virtuous. Chapters 25-29 is kind of advanced wisdom. Now topics are being nuanced in all kinds of ways. It's this developing curriculum. And as we develop across that curriculum, we're invited to see how themes are being qualified and nuanced and extended, how common topics tend to be, treated in diverse ways. Life is messier than we thought it was. It's more gray than the black and white of Proverbs 10-15. We read it along that trajectory. And ideally, as we do, just as we would in an educational curriculum, our character is formed, honed. We grow in wisdom and virtue along the way. And then third, final piece of advice I give them is to read the final two chapters, chapters 30 and 31, sort of as the application of wisdom. So we've completed this curriculum in chapters 10-29. We come to chapter 30, and Agur says, in case you thought you've graduated in the life of wisdom, think again. And he dishes out this hefty piece of humble pie. And so it just checks our limits as creatures. We will never arrive in the life of wisdom. And he seeks to cultivate humility within us. Before we come to chapter 31, which provides us with an ethic of leadership, as well as with a vision of the wise life incarnate in this woman who serves as a model for all people. So some points that help us along the way, and I think orient us to how we might traverse the book as a whole.
And then what makes it even better is then after Proverbs, you get into Ecclesiastes and you had all this wisdom, and then you're told that life is meaningless. And so it's like, right. I just love that transition. So those are three great tools and resources to think through how to read this book. And I think what's helpful, if you've never opened up the book of Proverbs, do so. If you're driving, don't do it now, but do so and really just look at how it's structured, because it's structured unlike any other book, I think, in the whole Bible, because it's really, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, it's these snippets of wisdom. It's these phrases. It's these adages. And so it's a hard book to just read a chapter at a time and say like, oh, I got 5-10 minutes. I'm going to just go through Proverbs chapter 12 right now, because each phrase really requires you to sit with it and let it kind of, stew a little bit and really get at, okay, what is the godly wisdom that is being offered in this single sentence or this single verse or whatever it is. So it's not a book that's meant to be read quickly. It's not a book that's meant to be read in long chunks, unless you're doing a project like you were sharing where you're trying to see the certain curricula of this section or whatever. But I know some people who start every day by reading a psalm and a proverb, and there's something to that where you're just getting these little chunks of wisdom at a time and letting them ruminate throughout the day.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go back to what you were saying too, because it's an interesting book because normally we talk about the different characters that we see in a book. Now, there's not necessarily people or characters in the book of Proverbs, but it's written in such a wise way to talk about a wisdom book as being a book that's written wisely, in that it does kind of give you characters where it gives you this idea of Lady Wisdom, or it gives you the fool or the mocker, or these people who you are being juxtaposed against if you were making the wise choice. And so it is really cleverly written in that way, where you can put yourself in a position of being the person. Like, I can picture the wise person and I can picture the foolish person in my head, and reading the choice that the wise makes as opposed to the foolish makes. It's like you're reading a bunch of different people, but you're not. And so I think I wanted to point that out too as something that makes this book very unique.
Very much so.
So let's talk about some of the major themes then that we get out of the book of Proverbs. What are some of these major themes that you've identified come through in the book?
Yeah, I think some of the major themes and how they shape our reading of the book really do revolve around that summary statement that I provided. If the book of Proverbs, if it opens with kind of its syllabus in chapter 1, verses 2-7, like, here are the learning outcomes, here's who this course is for, here's the prerequisite, which is the fear of the Lord, then I think we do well to recognize that all of the materials within the book, its themes around these character types that you just mentioned. Everyone's slotted into character types of righteous and wise, or wicked and foolish. You have the simple, the scoffer, the lazy, the diligent, among others. All of those character types are orienting us to the way in which they're designed to form our thinking and our character in all kinds of different ways. So in that respect, if the entire book, all of its materials, are all oriented to the formation of our character and the cultivation of virtue, we do well with that push to recognize what we have in Proverbs are not promises. What we have in Proverbs are not propositions about the way the world is or the way the world ought to be. What we have in Proverbs aren't even primarily principles. What we have in Proverbs are lenses through which to see ourselves and see the world, or they're little advertisements around, like, why should I be a wise or a righteous person? They're these catchy adverts that are all designed to sort of train our desires, our emotions. And so as I think about themes, all of which are intimately related to the different kinds of character types in the book, they're designed to shape our desires, direct our desires. Lady Wisdom, for example, in Proverbs 8, she's wooing us. We should desire her and look for her and search for her and embrace her, rather than desiring woman folly in chapter 9. We should desire to be like the righteous. We should desire to be like the wise. Those materials, they sharpen our moral reasoning, how to think. Even by providing sayings that slot people into the categories of righteous or wicked and wise and foolish, they're providing us with categories through which to think about other people, which to think about the world, how people act, what they do, what they desire. Well, Proverbs is providing us with categories through which to think through that, providing us with ways of seeing the world. And they're providing us, I think, along the lines that you were talking about earlier, Jason, with models to emulate, models to admire, so that if the wise and the righteous are wise and righteous because they reflect God's wisdom and righteousness, if that's why they're wise and righteous, then if we admire the wise and the righteous in the book of Proverbs, and if we emulate them, we are, by implication, emulating and admiring the character of God, and specifically the character of Christ.
Yeah.
And we can then participate in that form of life.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to be taking these snippets and just I think of them as little pieces that are building up this moral framework that you live your life, as you are thinking through the Christian life, right? I opened up the book of Proverbs here, and I opened it to Proverbs 12, where it says, the Lord detests lying lips. So it's like, okay, that's a part of a moral framework that I am building. And in Proverbs is completely full of that. Going on to Proverbs 13, verse 10, pride leads to conflict. Okay, so I'm building a moral framework then. I've heard about truth and honesty versus lying. I'm saying about pride. So it's all of these little snippets that it's almost these Lego pieces. I say that because I build Lego, that you're building up this moral framework. And as you said, it also helps to see these as lenses in which you're seeing the world, because it's not just for your own life. You're also seeing that in the world too, is you are able to make good, bad judgments, not being judgmental, but good, bad judgments. I'm like, okay, that is a wrong choice. That is a bad, that is against God's wisdom in this area, this area, this area. And so I think it helps to think of it as both as an inward and an outward thing that you are building up, and all of these little things just building onto that. That's right. Man, Proverbs is powerful.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, what does Proverbs teach us about God? I just said one thing, because the Lord detests lying lips. But what are some of the key things? I mean, there's so many, and I think you could write whole books about just what this book teaches about God. But what are some key things that you've pinpointed on what Proverbs teaches us about God?
Yeah, I think some key things to note, especially in Proverbs, are the way in which Proverbs associates God's work of creation with wisdom. So, in chapter 3, for example, among other places, chapter 3, verses 19 to 20, we read there, the Lord founded the earth by wisdom. He established the heavens by understanding. By knowledge, the deeps burst open and the clouds drip dew. It is by the tool of wisdom that he formed and ordered and filled the world. I mean, Proverbs 8 even develops that in verses 22 to 31, where it gives us a sneak peek behind Genesis 1:1. Yeah. Before God even creates, we have the generation of wisdom there, and wisdom as this eyewitness, this jubilant eyewitness to the way in which God orders and fills the world, delighting in the world. So God is intimately associated with creation, specifically with respect to wisdom. So there's a sense in Proverbs where God creates the world by wisdom. The world is ordered, therefore, and by wisdom and in relationship with God through wisdom, we can discern the order of the world and order our lives in accord with the order of the world. So Proverbs has much to say about God in relation to creation by wisdom. It also, offers us a vision of God who gives wisdom in the first place. I mean, wisdom is acquired through the fear of the Lord, which necessitates a relationship with God. And in Proverbs 2:6, we learn, among other places, God is the one who gives wisdom. It's a gift from him. It comes from outside of us. And then to the point you made, God hates certain things. Yeah. Proverbs orients us, lying lips, pride, unjust business practices, among other things. God is the God who sees everything. God is the God who blesses and satisfies the righteous. God is a God who is intimately involved in the mundane details of everyday life. So, Proverbs 16, verse 1, God is involved in effective communication. How do we even understand one another? Yeah. I mean, God we can misunderstand one another in all kinds of different ways. But when we actually understand one another, it seems that God is involved in effective communication. I mean, we, according to Proverbs 16, verse 1, we might offer these reflections in our heart. They belong to us. But the answer of the tongue comes from the Lord. Effective communication, connecting our heart to our words to other people, that comes from the Lord. Or in Proverbs 16, verse 3, the mundane details of life, commit your works to the Lord and your plans will succeed. I mean, hold on. I thought it was the other way around. Shouldn't I commit my plans to the Lord and my works will succeed? No, it's striking. It's commit your work to the Lord, and he will even ensure that what you intended all along will come about. It's God is involved, and he sees everything. He creates everything by wisdom. He gives wisdom as a gift, and he's even involved in these seemingly simple details of our everyday lives.
Each one of these things that you mentioned, I feel like I could spend like whole episodes talking about because I love them so much. The tying of wisdom and creation, to me, that is so key and fundamental to everything that we think of about who we are, our identity, who God is, the creation, like why we're here. It was all done with wisdom in mind. And that's so important to just wrestle with and noodle on a bit. But is the second thing that you mentioned that I want to go back on and harp on a little bit, because I think what Proverbs is doing is it is truly God taking a scalpel to your pride. And that is a powerful thing, because it's saying that wisdom is not from within. That wisdom is not something that you can manifest on your own.
Yeah.
But instead, wisdom is from God.
Yeah.
And to lead a truly wise life is from God. It is seeking God's wisdom. It is seeking God, his direction, what his moral framework is. That is what it means to live the wise life. So it's this counter to other beliefs that is like, if you seek within, I can find wisdom, or like, or it comes from intellectualism or whatever that is. Instead, this is the opposite. It's saying, nope, it's with God and God alone. And God chooses to impart his wisdom onto you if you seek him. Yeah. And I think that's so beautiful. I'm going to pop. And liberating. 100%. It's freeing. That is so true.
Yeah.
Chris, I'm going to make a time note here and pause this for a second, because I'm getting that Zoom thing that I was worried was going to happen is happening, where it's telling me I only have 10 minutes left in our meeting. So if you don't mind, I'm going to close this out and then rejoin us again so we can start it up again.
Right.
Cool. Thanks, man. There we go. Sweet, thanks. This is the sign for me that I need to go and start my own Zoom account, since ours is officially deactivated. No, please. It's all, I was wondering when it was going to happen. All right. So let me just mark the time code quickly. What is it, like 27? All right. So I'll clap us in again, and then I'll start with the next question.
Cool. Okay.
So we've been talking about what Proverbs teaches us about God. Now let's look at another question that I, could write books about too. What does Proverbs teach us about us, about humans?
That's a great question. I think that's the natural corollary, right? What we know about God ought to inform the way in which we understand who we are, especially in relation to him. And to your point around Proverbs kind of taking a scalpel to our pride, I think what the book teaches us, among other things, is we are finite, limited creatures. It teaches us that we are ultimately dependent on God for wisdom.
Yeah.
And more than that, we are ultimately dependent on others for wisdom. He who walks with the wise will be wise. I mean, chapters 1-9 are all about the parents instructing, they're like handing down and granting, giving, bestowing wisdom for the taking. Wisdom, as you mentioned, does not come from within. It comes from outside. And it comes, in this instance, from both God as well as through ordinary means of grace that God has given to us, like other people. And ultimately, at the end of the day, with Proverbs' anthropology, who we are, whether we have wisdom is so contingent on the nature of our character. So character serves as the seedbed for wisdom to kind of germinate and grow and blossom that comes from God and comes from others. And in the absence of a particular form of character or a particular posture, Proverbs seems to indicate you can't learn. I mean, the problem, for example, with the fool and the scoffer is not that they don't know they don't know propositional knowledge. I mean, Proverbs 26 is classic here, where it acknowledges, among other things, that fools know proverbs. Legs dangle from the lame, Proverbs 26:7, and a proverb in the mouth of fools. So fools know proverbs. They're given honor by members in the community. It's not that they're not effective people who don't know anything. They just don't know themselves. And because they don't know themselves, because they're not listeners, because they're not receptive to either God's wisdom or the wisdom of others, they can't be wise. They can't grow in wisdom. In fact, Jason, one of the most fatal conditions in all of Scripture is the description of a person who is wise in their own eyes. There's more hope for a fool than a person who's wise in their own eyes. And that's because of what you spoke to earlier, pride. They don't listen. They don't think they need anyone. They don't need to depend on anyone. They think that they're self-subsistent beings, that is God. And therefore, they can't learn. So Proverbs, in its vision of teaching, especially teaching wisdom and virtue, it focuses on character, but it acknowledges we are finite, limited creatures who are so dependent on God and so dependent on others in order to grow in wisdom and virtue.
No, that's so important, because we talked a little bit earlier about this idea of how Proverbs helps us to make a moral framework, both inward and outward. The inward is vital, because you can't just do the outward, because then you end up with, like what Jesus was saying, is stick in the other's eye, but the log in your own, and so what you do not want to do is just use Proverbs as a way to be judgmental or attack other people. What Proverbs needs to do is be that mirror that is looking back at us, saying, okay, how is this playing out in my own life? And only then can it then overflow and extend into how you're viewing the world around you, others around you. But that wisdom from other people is so important too. This is not meant to be, none of the Bible is meant to be done in isolation. It's meant to be done in community with others. So just imagine being in your small group or having your group of friends and talking about some of these Proverbs and just talking about what it means in your life, how you've struggled with this in the past, how you can be there for each other, how you can allow for accountability in one another to say, hey, just so you know, those were some lying lips I heard, and we know what happens with lying, just that kind of thing. And so it is a community-based thing. That's what the Christian faith is. And so thinking about Proverbs, not just as I'm reading it for myself in isolation, or I'm pulling out my daily proverb card for me, but instead it's, how can I engage with this with my Christian community, with my brothers and sisters? I think that's going to help change the way that you read the book.
For sure.
So normally what we do is we highlight a couple people in a book, not going to do that with this one. Instead, I was wondering if you could highlight any particular proverbs, maybe that go unnoticed or that maybe don't get the credit that they deserve.
Yeah. I think because the overall impression in our reading of Proverbs is that it's pretty simplistic or it's pretty idealistic. Like, really, the wise and the righteous, like everything's just grand. Like, is this really a realistic depiction of life? Yeah. Again, I think there, if we're recognizing, well, these are not propositions, this is not telling me the way the world is or ought to be. These are kind of like advertisements that are trying to attract me to sort of admire and to imitate this kind of form of life.
Yeah, go this way, not that way. Go this way. Yeah.
I think, to sort of, to the degree that I can, sort of impress on listeners the realism that you do find in the book. I think sayings like Proverbs 25, verse 26, a muddied spring and a polluted fountain, a righteous person tottering before the wicked. So you have elsewhere in the book, the righteous will never totter. Yeah. But then all of a sudden we read Proverbs 25, 26 and recognize, oh, I guess righteous people fall and they fail and they mess up. Yeah, that's pretty realistic. Or Proverbs 28, verse 12, when the righteous rejoice, great glory, but when the wicked arise, people hide. Oh, so I guess the righteous aren't always the ones that are ruling, that wicked people do rule, and it's demoralizing and debilitating to the people. Or Proverbs 13, verse 23, an abundance of food, the fallow ground of the poor, but the reality is this, it's swept away without justice. Oh, so I guess there are poor people out there who are not poor because they're lazy or they're wicked or they're foolish, but rather they're poor because they've been oppressed, that, there's been an injustice that's been committed against them. Life is not that simple. Yeah. And there are many proverbs, they're not the moral majority, but there are many proverbs that kind of sensitize us to the realism that we do find in the book.
I had to laugh when you mentioned that Proverbs 28 one, because that's a proverb that's attributed to Solomon, if my reading is correct. And he's talking about wicked rulers, and well, we know what's going to happen at the end of Solomon and for the kings thereafter.
Yeah, and maybe it's quite striking on that account that all mention of the king in the book of Proverbs up through chapter 24 is completely positive.
Oh, that is.
And then when Hezekiah's men arranged Solomon's Proverbs 25 to 29, you get all these sayings that now give us a vision of like politics as we know it. Like there are tyrannical rulers, they exploit people, they love, political lobbyists, they bend the truth. And it's just like, hold on a second here. What just happened as I shifted into this collection? Well, maybe Hezekiah had his way there.
Well, I think this transitions us well into what I ask about sticky parts of the book, if there are parts that are harder or more confusing, because what stands out to me is a bit like what you were talking about with the realism versus kind of the idealism, because I think it can be a tricky part, and you can correct me if I'm thinking of this wrong way, for people who may go into it, as you said earlier, these are not promises, but sometimes people read them as promises, and so you can get this idealistic view of, okay, if I'm just like this, if I'm just like this, and then you try to do that in real life and bad things still happen or whatever, and you go, wait, what is going on here? So I think that's one of those sticky parts, is remembering, like you said, these are more like advertisement, like signposts to point you in the right way, rather than saying that this is a promise, do this and this will happen. That's really not what a proverb is.
Right, it's not. And I think along those lines, Jason, you do well to just recognize, because these are not promises, we do well to have appropriate expectations as we read these verses. So, Proverbs 22:16, I've had so many mothers in church come to me and say, hey, I trained up my child in the way that they should have gone. But in the end, no, according to Proverbs 22:16, 22:6, they did not walk in the way of the Lord, that they're straying from the Lord. Well, that is not a promise. Yeah. And yes, it is a general principle, but I think there, as a sticky point, we're seeing even some of the ambiguity in a saying like that. Train up a child in the way that he or she wants to go It's, I don't know, or train up a child according to their aptitude, their age and circumstances, or train up a child in the ways of the Lord. I mean, they're all kind of options. And to train our perception and to train our moral reasoning, that proverb is open to all of those different ways of reading it. And it's helping us to see it from different angles rather than just offer us a cold, hard, and fast promise.
So I think it's an important thing to remember as you are reading through these proverbs, to, as you said so well, is go into it with proper expectations. As you are reading wisdom literature, these are wise thoughts or sayings that speak to godly principles. So that one that you were talking about of train up your child in the way they should go, yes, love them as a godly parent would love their kids, love them as best as you can, as you are loved by the Father. Like, that is a wise saying. And yes, that will, more likely than if you did not love them well, is going to point them towards the Lord. But again, free will comes in, and that child may choose whatever happens in their life, whatever course they decide to go down. So it's not a promise. It's not a guarantee, because there are such things as free will. There are such things as other actors that you cannot control. So you have to enter it with proper expectations, that it's not God saying, do this and I'm going to make it all work out for you.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think there, specifically with Proverbs 22:6, you're right to say, yes, this is a wise and virtuous principle that you ought to train up a child in accord with the way of the Lord. And then the second half of the saying, even when he becomes old, he will not depart from it. That's not the promise. That's like the bait. That's like the motivation of, you should do this because potentially this could be the outcome. Proverbs knows that we're desiring creatures. We need a little sort of push, as it were, to do certain things. It's the motivation. It's not a promise.
Are there any other proverbs that you've seen people kind of have problems with or take issues to, or that have been controversial?
I just think there's a broader reality here, Jason, where you have all of these sayings that speak to the same subject, but do so from very different angles and in very different ways. So the entire sort of discourse on wealth and poverty in the book of Proverbs is so complicated. I mean, we recognize that the wicked have wealth, but the righteous are promised to be blessed. And it's kind of like, hold on a second here. What's happening? Well, it's not so simple. And the same goes for friendship. There are different kinds of friends, and Proverbs recognizes that. Or it's discourse on your spouse. I mean, there's he who finds a wife finds a good thing. And there's all these sayings around a cantankerous wife, and you better live on the corner of your roof. So it's like, well, these are tensions. They're natural tensions that we find in the same sorts of realities that we encounter in everyday life. And so in an approach to Proverbs, there needs to be a sensitivity to, the book is going to give me various angles on all of these same kinds of subjects, whether it's wealth or poverty or work or speech or friendship or your spouse. And they're not all going to say the same thing. And we need to place them in conversation with one another to see the different facets of wisdom that they're offering us.
As we start to wrap up our look at Proverbs today, I always like to end by asking, you just wrote a commentary on the book of Proverbs. I'm going to put the link to it in the show notes. So in all of your time that you've spent researching and studying Proverbs, what is something that you think everybody should know but probably doesn't about this book?
I think something that everyone should know is that wisdom, according to Proverbs, is not simply an intellectual thing. Wisdom in Proverbs is holistic. It includes your intellect, but it also includes your emotions, your desires, your embodied form of life. All of that is wisdom. And I think a placeholder for recognizing that is the portrait of the valiant woman at the end of Proverbs in chapter 31. She is the incarnation of wisdom and virtue across the book. She is, as it were, the walking advertisement at the end for a life of wisdom and virtue. And what's so striking about that portrait of that woman is it is a portrait of power, but it's a portrait of power where wisdom is the exercise of power for the benefit of other people, for her household, for her community. And that woman is the model for all, men and women. And what we have in Proverbs 31 isn't sort of some snapshot of what every guy should look for in a woman. For women, it's not sort of that woman's daily planner or her weekly planner. It is a eulogy. It eulogizes her entire life. It's a long faithfulness of incarnate wisdom that provides a model for all. And I think orients us to the reality. Wisdom does include the intellectual, but it's so much more than that. It's holistic. Yeah. It includes your desires. It includes your emotions. It includes an entire embodied form of life.
I love that. Well, Dr. Chris Ansberry, thank you so much for helping to navigate us through Proverbs. I really appreciate it. And I'd appreciate it even more if you would mind closing us out by praying for our listeners as they dive into Proverbs. Maybe they've never read it before. Maybe they want to dive into it, or maybe take up like a proverb a day, like I talked about now after hearing this conversation. So would you mind closing us in prayer?
I'd love to. Thanks, Jason. Our Father, through your Son, by your Spirit, we are so grateful that you are the fount of all wisdom. And we're grateful that you tell us if we need wisdom, if we ask for wisdom, then you will give it to us. We pray that in your mercy, you would grant us wisdom so that we might reflect the wisdom of your Son, the Lord Jesus. We pray that you would help us as we read the book of Proverbs to grow in wisdom and in virtue. We pray that you would be pleased to even just use this conversation to enable us to read your word in such a way that we would be formed and conformed more into the image of your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen.